climate skeptic or a climate denier. I don't know what it means to deny the climate. I would say that there are climate exaggerators. In fact, many of you, I don't know if you saw this article or not, but The Climate of Complete Certainty by Bret Stephens that was in the New York Times talked about, and I'll just read a quote because I think it's a very important quote from this article. Anyone who's read the 2014 report of the IPCC knows that while modest 0.85 degrees Celsius warming of the Earth has occurred since 1880, much else that passes as accepted fact is really a matter of probabilities. That's especially true of the sophisticated but fallible models and simulations by which scientists attempt to peer into the climate future. To say this isn't to deny science isn't to acknowledge it honestly. And I think that, look, the debate, what the American people deserve, is a debate, objective, transparent discussion about this issue. And what Paris represents is a international agreement that put this country at a disadvantage with very little benefit environmentally across the globe.
Mr. Pruitt, may I ask a follow-up question on that, sir? Why then is the Arctic ice shelf melting? Why are the sea levels rising? Why are the hottest temperatures in the last decade essentially the hottest temperatures that we've seen on record?
We've actually been in a hiatus since the late 1990s.
But sir, when NASA says that 95% of the experts in this area around the world believe that the Earth is warming, and you are up there throwing out information that says, well, maybe this is being exaggerated and so forth, and you're talking about climate exaggerators, it just seems to a lot of people around the world that you and the President are just denying the reality. And the reality of the situation is that climate change is happening, and it is a significant threat to the planet.
Let me say this, and I've said it in the confirmation process, and I said it yesterday. And
right, the Arctic ice and the sea levels.
We have done a tremendous amount as a country to achieve reductions in CO2. And we have done that through technology and innovation. We will continue to do that. We will continue to stay engaged. We are a part, as you know, of the UNFCCC. And that process encourages voices by subnational groups and by countries across the globe. And we are going to stay engaged and try to work through agreements and achieve outcomes that put America's interest first. This is not a message to anyone in the world that America should be apologetic of its CO2 position. We are actually making tremendous advances. We're just not going to agree to frameworks and agreements that put us at an economic disadvantage and hurt citizens across this country. Yes, sir.
Though that you're putting your head in the sand, though, Mr. Pruitt. Are they a little worried that you're putting your head in the sand?
Well, there's no evidence of that. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. Your fellow Sooner Senator Inhofe said that while he has full confidence in the President in this, he is very nervous about lower-level career government employees in the EPA and the State Department in actually executing what's needed to exit the Paris Climate Accord. As the administrator of EPA, what do you say to your own senator?
What's important to know is that the President said unequivocally yesterday that the targets set in Paris, the 26 to 28% targets, are not enforceable and are not going to be complied with. The Green Climate Fund, where the United States committed $3 billion of initial funding, is not going to continue. That is unequivocally the case, and that's going to be immediate. Now, there are discussions that are ongoing with the Justice Department on the steps that we'll be taking to execute the withdrawal and the exit. That's something that's going to be happening over the next several weeks. But as far as the targets are concerned, as far as the Green Climate Fund, that is immediate, and it's something that's clear. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. European leaders have made it very clear.
I'm sorry?
European leaders have made it very clear the deal can't be renegotiated. So how does the President renegotiate a deal when the other parties aren't willing to come to the table?
Well, as he indicated, whether it's part of the Paris framework or a new deal, it's either approach.
But a new deal with whom if they're not going to sit down at the table with them?
Well, that's up to them, right? I mean, what America, the United States has a seat at the table. After all, we're the United States. And we are leading with respect to CO2 reduction. We have made tremendous progress. If nations around the globe want to seek to learn from us on what we're doing to reduce our CO2 footprint, we're going to share that with them. And that's something that should occur and will occur in the future. And we will reach out and reciprocate with nations who seek to achieve that.
And just a quick follow-up. You're the EPA administrator. Shouldn't you be able to tell the American people whether or not the president still believes that climate change is a hoax. Where does he stand?
As I indicated several times through the process, there's enough to deal with respect to the Paris Agreement and making an informed decision about this important issue. That's what our focus has been over the last several weeks. I've answered the question a couple of times. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. This gentleman right here. Yes, this gentleman right here. This gentleman right here. Yes.
Thank you. Isn't it of concern that the United States has broken a promise to 190 countries, and the president did not address that particular point? And second, you've several times raised that the lowering of CO2 levels. Isn't the reason for lower CO2 levels because of blocking the smokestack spews that now are not allowed, the kind of regulations that the administration is now opposing?
As I indicated, largely we have reduced our CO2 footprint through innovation and technology, not the least of which is hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. Now, the first part of your question, I forget?
Isn't it of concern that we broke a promise to 190 countries, and how does that help our credibility?
Well, truly, this gentleman's question back here, if it was a promise that was enforceable and was going to obligate this country, then it should have been ratified as a treaty, right? The exposure here to us domestically was 26 to 28% targets that were part of an international agreement, and there are provisions in the Clean Air Act that actually allow for lawsuits to be filed domestically to compel regulation to meet those kinds of percentages. This was as much about constitutional and legal concerns as anything else, and the president dealt decisively with that. But let's, again, the important thing here is it put us in economic disadvantage. The world applauded. The world applauded when we joined Paris. And you know why? I think they applauded because they knew it was going to put this country at an economic disadvantage. And the reason European leaders, going back to the question earlier, that I think they want us to stay in is because they know it will continue to shackle our economy, though we are leading the world with respect to our CO2 reduction. That's all I've got. I've got to head to the airport. Thank you very much.
Our word is not our bond.
Thank you.
You want your glasses?
Why did you celebrate at a French restaurant last night? Was that a symbolic gesture?
Thanks, Administrator Pruitt. Earlier this morning, the May jobs report was released showing that Americans seeking jobs are having more success finding them than at any point in the last 16 years. There's a lot of positive signs coming out of the job market. Over 600,000 private sector jobs have been added since the President took office. The key U6 unemployment rate, which gives a broader look at both unemployment and underemployment, fell a full percentage point since the President took office in January. Long-term unemployment is down by 187,000 since the President took office. And America's miners and drillers are getting back to work, with that sector showing job growth for the seventh straight month. The President's not going to stop until every American who wants to work can find meaningful employment. That's why we're working tirelessly on policies that will keep the economy growing, with a tax plan that will leave more money in the pockets of hardworking Americans and making it easier for businesses to thrive, an infrastructure initiative that will generate $1 trillion of investment and put Americans back to work, rebuilding our nation's crumbling roads and bridges, repealing and replacing the job-killing Obamacare with a system that encourages competition and drives prices down, and a systematic regulatory reform to reduce unnecessary burdens on manufacturing and other key industries, aiming for the most far-reaching rollback since the Reagan years. You can expect the President to be focusing even more on jobs this month and holding events in Washington and outside, pushing his pro-growth, pro-jobs agenda. Later this afternoon, the President is going to be signing two bills that were both passed with bipartisan support that help protect those who protect us, our nation's veterans and public safety officers. First, the Public Safety Officers Benefit Improvement Act of 2017, which was co-sponsored by Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley of Iowa and Senator Kristen Gillibrand of New York. It was unanimously passed by the Senate last month. It will reduce the unacceptable backlog of families awaiting approval of survivor benefits and public safety officers that were killed in the line of duty. The second is the American Law Enforcement Heroes Act, which is co-sponsored by Senator John Cornyn and Senator Amy Klobuchar, which also unanimously passed the Senate and assists state and local law enforcement in adding veterans to their forces by prioritizing the Department of Justice funding to law enforcement agencies that is used to hire veterans. It's critical that we support our veterans and the loved ones of those who have paid the ultimate price while protecting our communities. The President's glad to be signing these important bills today, and there'll be a pool spray at the top of that shortly. Also in Washington today, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos visited the Eagle Public Charter School this morning to show the administration's support for inclusive school environments and celebrate the launch of the Department of Education's new Individual with Disabilities Act effort. At the State Department, Secretary Tillerson met this morning with Foreign Minister of Brazil and is departing for Sydney, Australia this afternoon, where he will join Defense Secretary Mattis to participate in the 2017 Australia-United States ministerial consultations. Prior to his arrival in Australia, Secretary Mattis will attend the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, where he will deliver remarks and meet with regional allies and counterparts to discuss security issues. With that, I'd be glad to take a few questions. Kevin.
Thanks, Sean. I want to ask about the push for the travel ban to the U.S. Supreme Court. Is it fair to say that one of the reasons that the president wants to keep this going is obviously now we have a full court impaneled, but also because it gives the White House perhaps a chance to build on some momentum, especially if you look back at yesterday, it would appear that his base was very pleased with what the president decided to do. Is that part of the calculus? And I'd also like to ask as a follow about the XL pipeline. Can you give us an update on what's happening with that in terms of jobs and development?
Yeah. I think that what we've said with respect to the executive order in question has been fairly consistent since its implementation and in the first court action. So last night we asked the Supreme Court to hear this important case and are confident that the President's executive order is well within his lawful authority to keep the nation safe and protect our communities from terrorism. The President's not required to admit people from countries that sponsor or shelter terrorism, and until he determines that they are properly vetted and do not pose a threat or risk to the United States. It's pretty consistent with what we've talked about. I don't have an update on, are you talking about in terms of production for Keystone? I don't have that at this time. Zeke?
Thanks, John. You were asked earlier this week about the President's personal views on climate change and whether or not he believes it's a hoax. You said you hadn't had a chance to have that conversation with him. Now it's been 48, 72 hours. What does the President actually believe about climate change? Does he still believe it's a hoax? Could you clarify that, since apparently nobody else in the White House can?
Yeah, I have not had an opportunity to have that discussion.
Like, the American people deserve to know what the President believes on such
I
an
think
important
that
issue.
Administrator Pruitt pointed out that what the President is focused on is making sure that we have clean water, clean air, and making sure that we have the best deal for the American workers. Blake.
Sure.
Sorry.
No worries. Quick question for you on related to the Paris Climate Agreement. Why does the President feel it's important to continue to reduce carbon emissions and export clean energy technology?
I think he understands the importance of clean air, clean water, as I just mentioned, and a healthy environment, but also doing so in a way that provides the American workers and our economy a way to grow. But obviously, as Administrator Pruitt pointed out, that we've got a lot of technology that we can export to other countries and help them.
Just a quick question as it relates to climate change. A very simple definition of climate change is a change in the Earth's weather patterns. The EPA administrator said today that he does feel there is some value to the studies that say that the Earth is warming somewhat. Does the President share the EPA administrator's thoughts on this topic? And why has the administration sort of backed away from using the words climate change?
I have not, as I mentioned to Zeke, I have not had an opportunity to specifically talk to the President about that. Amen.
Thanks, Sean. Yesterday, the President painted a pretty dire economic picture if the United States were to stay in the Paris Accord, saying it would be disastrous for the U.S. economy. And yet, dozens of the top CEOs of American corporations lobbied the President in order to stay in the Paris Accords. Why would the President argue that this is bad for the economy if all of those CEOs are saying, you know what, we need to do this? Is the President right about the economic forecast and all those private sector leaders wrong?
I think the President took input from a lot of individuals, and there were other sectors that were very concerned about the implementation of it. And frankly, I think there were some companies and some organizations that are among those that you mentioned that while they maybe wanted to stay in, also expressed concern about the target levels. But at the end of the day, the President's #1 priority is to get the best deal for the American people. This is who they elected last year. This was, I think, one of the things that we've got to remember is that the President was very clear on the campaign trail about his position on this, but he was also clear that he was going to negotiate the best deal for the American people. And if you look at all of the deals that we have, whether they're the trade deals or Paris, the President's made it very clear that he's committed to getting the best deal for America, America's workers, America's manufacturers.
John, is going to replace Elon Musk and Bob Iger on the President's Advisory Council?
I don't know at this point. Jim.
Thank you, Sean. The president's critics are claiming that the, pulling out of the accord will lift China as a global leader. Do you agree with that sentiment? What does the White House have to say about that?
Well, I think part of the reason that the president said it was a bad deal yesterday is because countries, including China, were not making substantial progress in reducing their carbon footprint. They weren't doing enough, and America was carrying the load. So I think by negotiating a better deal, hopefully we can get a better result for our country and the world. John.
Thank you, Sean. Yesterday, President Macron of France delivered a sharply worded speech in English attacking the president on the climate change decision, saying it is bad for all of our children, and he specifically called on scientists to come and move to France. What's the president's response to President Macron?
I think that the president has made it clear since day one that his job is to protect the interest of this country and our citizens. As he said yesterday, he was elected to represent Pittsburgh, not Paris. Hunter.
Thank you, Sean. The Washington Post has reported that the administration is considering returning these properties in Maryland and New York to Russia. What is the reason for that, and what would the White House have to see before giving back those properties?
The State Department issued comments on that earlier, saying, quote, the U.S. and Russia have reached no agreements. They're projecting negotiations further along than they are. So the State Department's the lead on that. They've been very clear where we stand on that. Charlie?
Has the president been following the Kathy Griffin meltdown, and does the family want a personal apology for the beheading of him?
Does what, please?
Does the family want a personal apology from Kathy Griffin after the beheading?
Yeah, the president, the first lady, and the Secret Service have all made it very clear their view on those thoughts. Steve?
Sean, it's been a matter of curiosity in this town for a couple of days now. Is the White House going to invoke executive privilege to prevent James Comey from testifying before the Senate Intelligence Panel next week?
That committee hearing was just noticed, and I think obviously it's got to be reviewed.
So that's not a no?
No, I was just saying literally, my understanding is the date for that hearing was just set. I have not spoken to counsel yet. I don't know how they're going to respond. Jen.
Two questions, Sean. One on the tax bill and one on the debt ceiling. In the Rose Garden yesterday, the president said something about our tax bill is moving along in Congress very well. We've heard something about a bill being drafted in House Ways and Means. Is that what he was talking about, or what tax bill was he referring to?
I think, as you know, Secretary Mnuchin and Director Cohen were here a couple weeks ago laying out the broad principles of what they look to see in legislation. They've had several discussions, both in the House and the Senate, bipartisan and industry groups, and I think that the reception that the President's initiative has received in both chambers is moving along very well with leadership and rank-and-file members.
And then on the debt ceiling, we've been getting some mixed messages from administration officials on whether you'd like to see a clean debt bill or whether you'd be, can you explain what the President's feeling is on whether he'd like to see riders attached on decreasing spending or whatever? What is his feeling?
I think both Secretary Mnuchin and Director Mulvaney have weighed in on this. This is something that we're going to work with Congress on. So we're not there yet. It's something that our team is going to continue to work with them on. Jessica.
Thanks, John. Two questions. Number one, when we heard the administrator talk about his decision on the Paris Climate Accord, he said it's not a signal that the U.S. wants to disengage on climate policy. So what are the steps that the administration is taking to engage internationally on climate? And secondly, as you well know, climate has been a key part of cooperation between the U.S. and China. Will you try to replace that very important sort of intersection of interest with something else? Will you continue to do some technological cooperation on clean energy, for example, with the Chinese? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, this is a decision that was just made yesterday afternoon, and I think the President is going to engage both with domestic stakeholders. He mentioned in the speech yesterday he looks forward to talking to leaders in both parties about a way forward and reasonable ways in which we can engage in that. And then he'll obviously continue to talk to world leaders, but that's a process that has to evolve. What's that?
China, the relationship with China as a point of cooperation. Have you guys given some thought to how you'll manage? Because the model was you manage tensions with China as the U.S. government by having areas of cooperation, and this was previously an area of cooperation. There's obviously other areas that the White House is working on now with China, but do you envision some other cooperation on the area of climate with the Chinese government?
Well, the relationship that President Trump has established through President Xi has been quite remarkable. He's talked about it very clearly, and it's a model in which they'll continue to build their relationship and talk about issues, whether it's this or North Korea or other areas, economic areas, that they're going to work together on. So I think that the great thing about this issue is that the relationship that the President has and continues to build with President Xi is one that will allow them to move forward.
Thank you, Sean. In a recent statement by Senator McCain, he said that Vladimir Putin is a greater threat to the United States security of the U.S. than ISIS. Has the President had any conversation with you about that comment?
No, he hasn't.
Sean, thank you. Secretary Mnuchin has said that he wants the debt ceiling raised before the August recess, that we're going to run out of money by then. This morning, he wants it cleaned as well. This morning, Gary Cohn said that the administration is willing to do whatever with Congress to get it passed before August, and the Freedom Caucus has said they want spending cuts. So what does this look like? It doesn't sound as if the Treasury Secretary is going to get a clean bill. What's the administration willing to take as far as spending cuts to get the debt ceiling raised?
I mean, I think that was the nature of what Jen was asking, and I think that is a conversation that our team is going to have with congressional leaders and other stakeholders, Freedom Caucus and other members about what it's going to take. I think there's bipartisan recognition that we need to get that done. And so Secretary Mnuchin, Director Cohn, Director Mulvaney, and other members of the team will continue to work with congressional leaders to figure out what it takes to get it done. April.
Sean, could you tell me, how is the President dealing with the fact that there are several mayors, many mayors, from a bipartisan group of the U.S. Conference of Mayors who are against the President's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement? How does this President move forward with what he's saying about making coal great again and taking walking away from the economics of clean energy, and then walking out of Paris when you have mayors who are saying we're going to continue with the Paris Agreement?
Well, if a mayor or a governor wants to enact a policy, that's on a range of issues, they're accountable to their own voters, and that's what they should do. We believe in states' rights, and so if a locality, a municipality, or a state wants to enact a policy that their voters or their citizens believe in, then that's what they should do.
And one other question.
But I will say that with respect to elected officials, there was, I think, a large contingent of officials at every level of government that were very pleased with the President's decision yesterday and applauded him for that.
A bipartisan group of Republican and Democratic mayors who are very acceptable.
And we have some bipartisan support for it.
Okay, and last topic. There are numbers of reports on hate crimes. Nooses have been found at the museum, the new museum that the President toured, the African American History and Culture Museum. And also there was some very negative word, one of the worst words you can say, spray painting on LeBron James' home. What is the President saying about this? Specifically, as people are saying, over the last 130 plus days, people are feeling that there has been a divide that is perpetuated from this White House.
Well, I would respectfully disagree with the premise of that. I think we need to denounce hate in any form, in any act, and this President made it clear from election night to his inauguration that he wants to unite this country and move it forward. Caitlin.
Thank you. Did Secretary of State Rex Tillerson endorse withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement?
I'm not privy to the conversations that individuals had with the President.
There really wasn't at the announcement yesterday?
I don't know.
Okay, secondly, can you clarify the nature of the conversations that Jared Kushner had with Russian officials and a banker in December? And what was the date of the meeting with the banker?
I cannot, and as I've mentioned the other day, that we're focused on the President's agenda, and going forward, all questions on these matters will be referred to outside counsel Mark Casper.
But how can you not answer questions on it when the President himself tweets about it?
We're focused on his agenda, and going forward, all questions on this matter will be referred to outside counsel. Jill. Jill.
Two things. Firstly, nobody is actually responding to any of those questions. I don't know where you guys are in actually finding spokespeople or people who want to respond to those. That would be helpful. Okay. And then two things. Do you guys have any update on the search for the FBI director?
As I mentioned yesterday, I guess a couple days ago, the President has met with some candidates. When we have an update on that, we'll let you know.
Okay. And then you said that you hadn't talked to the President yet about whether he still believes that climate change is a hoax. Would it be possible for you to have that conversation with him and then report back to us at the next briefing?
If I can, I will. Mary.
Given that you and Administrator Pruitt can't say where the president stands on climate change, does this mean that members of this administration helped the president make this decision to withdraw from the Paris Accord without knowing where the president stands, without knowing whether or not he thinks climate change is real?
My understanding is that individuals gave the president advice on the deal at hand, and he made a decision on what was best for the country and our people on the merits of the agreement.
Sean, we know that the president heard a lot of points of view on this, on both sides of the issue, and there was an impression, maybe a false impression, that it was a difficult decision and that he was wavering. In the end, though, yesterday, he was emphatic about his, getting out of the agreement. In the end, was this an easy decision or was it a close decision?
I honestly don't know. I mean, that's what the president is the ultimate decider, and when he comes to make a decision, when he gets the information that he's required, he lets us know that he has a decision and he announces it.
One other thing, there's a lot of talk about renegotiation. Why renegotiate? The United States has the authority to simply reduce the targets. Why not just do that?
Because the president believes that it is in our country's best interest to renegotiate the deal.
The president signed a waiver yesterday that delayed his campaign's promise to move the embassy to Jerusalem. I know you said that this was to not hinder any sort of peace deal, but how confident can his supporters be that this is a campaign promise that he's going to keep?
I think when the president signed the waiver under the Jerusalem Embassy Act and delayed moving the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, no one should consider the step in any way to be a retreat from the president's strong support for Israel and for the U.S.-Israeli relationship. The president made this decision to maximize the chance of successfully negotiating a deal between Israel and the Palestinians, fulfilling a solemn obligation to defend America's national security interest. But as he repeatedly stated his intention to move the embassy, the question is not if that move happens, but when.
But he promised during the campaign to do it on day one. I mean, is there a time frame now for when he will do this?
His ultimate goal is to get peace, and as I said, it's not an if, it's a when. Francesca.
Thank you, Sean. Following up on Caitlin's question, and then I have a second thing after that, is it still the administration's position, though, that Jared Kushner was in the meeting with the Russian banker as a representative of the transition, representing the president?
As I said to Caitlin, we're focused on the president's agenda, and going forward, all questions on these matters will be referred to outside counsel Mark Keslowitz.
Something you may be able to answer directly is, does the president still have confidence in Jared Kushner?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Sean. One of the ethics pledge waivers that the White House released applied to all White House appointees concerning discussions with the news media and was retroactive. Was that aimed at, did the White House have Steve Bannon's communications with Breitbart News in mind? Was that applied retroactively to address those communications? And any response to Director Schaub's claim that if you need a retroactive waiver, you have violated a rule?
Yeah, that's correct. There's two pieces to that are important. One is, remember, this didn't have to do with the law or regulations. This had to do with the president's pledge, his ethics pledge. So he is the ultimate decider on that. This isn't with respect to a law or regulation. And that what we discovered was that several individuals on staff had previously worked for media organizations, and in order to continue having those discussions and advancing the president's agenda and priorities, it was important to make sure that all individuals had the opportunity to be able to speak to the media about what the president was doing to make the country stronger. For what it's worth, today happens to be National Leave Work Early Day. I hope you all get a chance to participate. If you didn't, maybe go home if you participated in National Donut Day and go home a little early and work it off. But with that, I hope you get to take advantage of that day. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Are you going home early?
You've been watching the White House briefing, the administration defending the president's controversial decision to pull out of the Paris climate deal. That was the focus of this press conference. We heard from the EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, followed by Sean Spicer, the press secretary. Most notably, they both still refusing to say whether President Trump believes climate change is real. Let's go first to CNN political director David Chalian. On that note, David, why does this administration continue to not answer the question?
It's confounding, Anna. It really is even more confounding, of course, because here we are in the week that this White House this president made his biggest move on the issue of climate change, and for days now, this White House is unable to answer a fundamental question about his beliefs about climate change? In the past, he has called it a hoax. Does he believe that man contributes to the changing climate on the planet? They can't answer that. And not only, they don't even attempt to. They just say that that's not important here, that the focus has been just on Paris. That's what Pruitt said over and over again. What is more astounding is that the president's press secretary, this is the person who is supposed to be able to communicate to the American people through reporters about the president's thinking, his decision making, can go into the Oval Office and say, hey boss, let me understand this so I can go out and explain it. Well, he can't, because he just said that he has not had the opportunity to speak with the president, on whose behalf he speaks, has not had the opportunity to speak with the president about his fundamental belief about the central policy issue that dominated the president's week. It makes no sense.
And I want to bring in Jim Acosta, who was just at that briefing. We heard Jim Acosta asking questions about the science, in fact. And Jim, this administration continues to deflect when it comes to the issue of climate change, which, of course, is at the heart of the Paris Climate Agreement.
That's right, Anna, and they've had a good 24 hours to come up with an answer to this question. Does the president believe climate change is a hoax? Does he believe climate change is real? And the White House, even after having 24 hours or so to come up with an answer to this question, and this question's been asked before for days, weeks, months, for a very long time now, just does not have an answer to that question. And it is kind of astounding, because when you look at the preponderance of evidence, when you look at what the scientific community says all over the world, with almost near 100% certainty that the planet is warming, that climate change is occurring, and that human activity is contributing to that climate change. But you heard not only from the EPA administrator, from the White House press secretary, the top officials who spoke to this yesterday, it is really sort of a stunning lack of answer to what is a critical question, and it appears, that this White House, this president, made this decision very much for political reasons, that they wanted to keep a campaign promise, and that they wanted to keep a campaign promise that they believed to be essential to some of these very key battleground states, with their eyes focused to 2020. As incredible as that may sound, that is how a White House works, no matter who's in office. There are always operatives inside of the administration who are always looking to the next election, to the midterms, and so on. So it is kind of incredible to hear that. I do think there were some other very important questions that were also not answered. First among them, during this briefing, you heard it during Sean Spicer's portion of the briefing, when he was asked whether the president will invoke executive privilege to try to block the former FBI director, James Comey, who was fired by the president, from testifying next week. Sean Spicer said that is being looked at. He did not give an answer to that question. So we now have, starting today, and even though Sean Spicer noted it is leave work early day today, people are going to be focused on this question all weekend long, all next week, as we head into this Comey hearing, whether or not the president and his legal team will determine at the last second that perhaps the president can attempt this. And so now, in addition to all these other questions about climate change that weren't answered, we now have another very, very, very big question for this president that needs to be answered, because it is critical as to whether or not we'll hear from James Comey next week. Anna.
A National Leave Work Early Day on a Friday seemed to be a convenient excuse to get the heck out of there from the press conference, when we've had so limited access to this administration in terms of asking questions. There have been limitations to these press briefings. Let me bring in Stephen Moore.
The climate was getting warm in this room, that's for sure, Anna.
I can only imagine the temperature was going up. You could hear it in some of those reporters' questions, no doubt about it. Jim Acosta, stand by. I want to bring in Stephen Moore. He's our senior economic analyst for CNN, also a Trump supporter. You also were an advisor of the president during the campaign. Stephen Moore, why can't his administration answer the question, the fundamental question about whether or not this president believes climate change is real?
I don't know the answer to that, but I will say this, that I think it's not fair to say that President Trump took this action for political reasons. Now, yes, he did promise this during the campaign. It was a very popular campaign pledge. I traveled around with then candidate Trump, and when he talked about getting us out of the Paris Accord in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania and
Should
Michigan,
they be able to answer the question, though, about climate change? That is what this is all about, is it not?
Well, I don't know what his belief is on this, but I'll say this. It's the fundamental issue here is how is this going to affect our economy? we've done some really amazing research at the Heritage Foundation, a number of other studies that put the job losses at between 500,000 and a million. We can't afford to do that. We have too many unemployed people in this country right now. We've got to make sure that we're protecting the jobs of our oil and gas workers, our steel workers, our coal workers. We just had a good report, by the way, today that there was an increase in mining jobs. So we're seeing a turnaround in the coal industry, something a lot of
That's right,
people said
400
couldn't
mining
happen.
jobs were added in the last month, according to the
and
jobs
coal
report today. But also worth noting that the steelworker union from the steelworkers actually came out yesterday speaking out against this move. We've also heard a backlash from a lot of different companies saying this was the wrong way to go economically.
I just want to. Did you say that the steelworker union came out against it?
A steelworker union came out against it.
Because I've talked to a lot of the steel workers, and they are dead set against this because they know their jobs are very much in jeopardy.
No, I think that is a controversial point. Let me bring in Jeffrey Sachs, because I know you have a different opinion on the economic side of things, Jeffrey.
It's just unbelievable. Every word has been a lie for the last 2 days. So much ignorance, and you have Stephen Moore, and he is from the Heritage Foundation, paid for by the Koch brothers that have engineered the whole story here. So it's just endless. Big money of the Koch brothers is behind this, and Mr. Moore and his Heritage Foundation is a Koch brothers financed operation, and this is corruption, and it's so clear. And it's disgusting after a while because they're all lying.
Jeffrey, this study was the National Economic Research Associate study that Stephen was just citing that we've heard from the Trump administration. Why do you not believe that's a credible source?
There are about 20,000 coal miners in this country out of 150 million people. This is so bogus, it's unbelievable. Everything that Trump has said is bogus. And the idea that he's given to the American people that somehow this is an agreement that is against America, that's biased against America, this is a completely symmetrical agreement in which all 193 countries have agreed to the same thing. They have agreed to submit national plans of action under a common framework. And so it's all a lie. And the important thing for your viewers to understand is this is the future of their children and their grandchildren. And this man is wrecking the planet, and it's because of the oil, gas, and coal interests that have funded the Heritage Foundation, that have funded Stephen Moore, and that have funded the 22 senators that wrote to the president last week saying to do this. This is a game, and it's a game against my children and my grandchildren, and it's disgusting.
Stephen, I'll give you a chance to respond.
Well, Jeff just needs to get his facts straight. I mean, we get less than 3% of our budget from the Koch. So, Jeff, I don't know where you're getting your facts from, but what you just said is a lie.
I know where I'm getting my facts from. You're on the take.
Right. Well, now, one of the points I think needs to be made here is that there's a climate change industrial complex. That this is a multi-billion-dollar movement now. That Elon Musk. Why is Elon Musk against us pulling out? Guess what? Elon Musk's two major businesses,
and the Koch brothers are $100 billion, Stephen Moore.
No, but my point is that, but the Koch brothers don't get any government money, Jeff. And Elon Musk gets $4.9 billion.
So the Republican Party in the Congress, they finance
but they don't get any government money.
The American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute. We have been taken over, and you have been taken over, and I'm shocked that you are.
By the way, I was on a couple weeks ago with Jeff Sachs, and he said that the coal mining industry was dead, and we've seen a 16% increase just since Donald Trump was elected, and we have more coal jobs today. So you're just wrong, Jeff.
Okay, let me move the conversation forward here. I want to put in an opportunity to get our other analysts into the conversation. So let's listen to Jim Acosta, his exchange with the EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, and then we'll talk on the other side.
Why then is the Arctic ice shelf melting? Why are the sea levels rising? Why are the hottest temperatures in the last decade essentially the hottest temperatures that we've seen on record?
We've actually been in a hiatus. We've actually been in a hiatus since the late 1990s.
But sir, so there's when NASA says that 95% of the experts in this area around the world believe that the Earth is warming, and you are up there throwing out information that says, well, maybe this is being exaggerated and so forth, and you're talking about climate exaggerators, it just seems to a lot of people around the world that you and the president are just denying the reality. And the reality of the situation is that climate change is happening, and it is a significant threat to the planet.
Let me say this, and I've said it in the confirmation process, and I said it yesterday.
Right,
No, let me
Arctic
finish.
ice and the sea levels.
We have done a tremendous amount as a country to achieve reductions in CO2. And we have done that through technology and innovation. We will continue to do that. We will continue to stay engaged. We are a part, as you know, of the UNFCCC, and that process encourages voices by subnational groups and by countries across the globe, and we are going to stay engaged and try to work through agreements and achieve outcomes that put America's interest first. This is not a message to anyone in the world that America is should be apologetic of its CO2 position. We are actually making tremendous advances. We're just not going to agree to frameworks and agreements that put us at an economic disadvantage and hurt citizens across this country. Yes, sir.
Though, that you're putting your head in the sand, though, Mr. Pruitt. Are they a little worried that you're putting your head in the sand?
Well, there's no evidence of that.
Miles O'Brien is also with us. You're very connected to the scientific community. What did you make of that exchange and the answer we heard from the administration?
Well, first of all, let's pick apart this so-called pause in global warming. That is a classic cherry-pick piece of data which comes from climate deniers. They pick a year in the late 90s where there was an El Nino effect, and they say from that point on you'll see there's a pause. The fact of the matter is 15 of the last 17 years have been record heat for the climate, for the planet, period. The evidence is there. This is not about belief. These are facts. And there is apparently an attempt here to go for alternate facts. But it's just like saying, do you believe the sky is blue? Or do you believe the sun will rise? You don't. It's not a belief thing. The facts are really... The facts are the facts. There's no alternative facts. It's like looking at the mall and saying there are more people there than there were for Obama's inauguration. The facts are this is happening. And I think we have our answer from the administration by saying nothing. By doing what they've done, and then by not saying one way or another whether it's a hoax, they have tacitly said, we believe it's not true. And that is absolutely irrefutable on several counts. As we speak, Anna, there is a piece of Antarctic ice the size of Delaware that is about to drop off into the ocean. Now, that won't increase the sea level in any appreciable way right away, but it will unleash the ability for more water to come, more ice to come off of Antarctica and into the ocean, and ultimately lead to more sea level rise. The evidence is all around us. The science is as clear as it gets. It is not a hoax, and if you accept the facts, it is incumbent that we all do something about it, because there is no greater existential threat to us all.
We kept on hearing Scott Pruitt use the words, there's nothing to be apologetic about. The U.S. is still a leader when it comes to reducing carbon emissions and when it comes to investing in clean energy development. What say you?
Well, some of this has to do with Obama administration policies, the Clean Power Plan. Some of this is market forces. Coal is going out. You know, we're not going to go back to whale oil either. This is a natural evolution that is occurring. Fracked natural gas is cheaper. It has less carbon. That's helped a little bit. Renewables are taking hold. A lot of the market forces are in place here, and the market has already spoken on this. Large corporations, small corporations, and all this talk about jobs being lost. Let's talk about the jobs being gained. And the fact is, the renewable sector, the clean energy sector, has tremendous opportunity. If we want America to be first in the world, we need to be in this game. We will be also-rans if we step aside.
I want to actually read you a quote that I found really interesting. Andrew Steer with the World Resources Institute said, if you simply add up the commitments under the Paris deal until 2025, it's about $1 trillion a year of investment that is open for bidding. Sounds like there's a big economic upside to being part of this Paris deal, Shelby Holiday.
Yes, and watching that press briefing sort of underscores first of all, the confusion within the administration. You know, one hand isn't talking to the other, whether it's the debt ceiling, whether it's climate change, whether it's taxes. But they continue to cite, one thing they are all saying is that this is America first, this is in America's best interest. And climate change does have a huge economic angle. You know, people say if the temperature continues to rise, that hurts industries, it hurts agriculture, it hurts manufacturing, incomes will fall. It has a global economic impact, and so that's one of the big reasons everyone in the world has been addressing it. I do think it's really fascinating that Donald Trump is a jobs first, America first, economy first president, yet he ignored virtually all of the advice he got from Fortune 500 CEOs, from a lot of people in the business community on this pact. It's not a surprise that he pulled out of the Paris Agreement. It's something he said he would do on the campaign trail, so we can't sit here and be shocked that he did it. But it is surprising that he ignored not the advice of Jared and Ivanka at the advice of some brilliant CEOs who lead some of the biggest
along with
companies
many
in the
of our
world.
world's allies.
Right.
We've got to leave it there for a moment, guys. Stand by, everyone. More breaking news to talk about this hour. The White House suggests President Trump is deciding whether to use executive privilege to try and block fired FBI Director James Comey from testifying next week. The risk, the reality.
For the Senate Intelligence Panel next week.
That committee hearing was just noticed, and I think obviously it's got to be reviewed.
So that's not a no.
No, I was just saying I don't. Literally, my understanding is the date for that hearing was just set. I have not spoken to counsel yet. I don't know how they're gonna respond.
That was White House Press Secretary just moments ago, Sean Spicer, and we're getting new details into what fired FBI Director James Comey might reveal during that much-anticipated testimony next week. A source tells CNN that Comey was, quote, disturbed by his interactions with the president and thought perhaps President Trump needed to, quote, be trained about how to interact with the FBI. Furthermore, Comey told our source he didn't believe any of the president's individual actions obstructed justice. But the quote here, aggregate pattern of behavior could be a different story. Joining me now to talk more about this is CNN's justice correspondent Jessica Schneider. So Jessica, what more do we know about this in anticipation of Comey's testimony?
Well, at first, we're dealing with the issue of executive privilege. You heard it from Press Secretary Sean Spicer right there. The decision's still not made. The White House, though, not ruling that possibility out. So there's still question as to whether or not President Trump will try to block some of James Comey's testimony on Thursday. But, you know, we do know from our sources that Comey is eager to tell his story. And today, a source with knowledge of Comey's thinking tells us that Comey, after he met with the president, he was, in fact, disturbed by his interactions. But he did think that the president could eventually be taught on how to deal with the FBI director, and really Comey viewed it as sort of an ongoing project, teaching the president. And the source also says that Comey, he would have done more than just write a memo if he actually thought that any one of those interactions rose to the level of obstruction of justice. But of course, it's possible that if Comey takes all these incidents together during his testimony next week, that he might come to a different conclusion about this. And of course, that brings us back to the question of will President Trump try to exert executive privilege to stop this testimony either in full or in part? Earlier this morning, this is how Counselor Kellyanne Conway responded.
Does he want former Director Comey to testify before Congress?
Well, we'll be watching with the rest of the world when Director Comey testifies. The last time he testified under oath, the FBI had a scurry to correct that testimony. He was off by hundreds of thousands in his count, his sworn testimony count of the number of information, the number of emails that Huma Abedin allegedly sent to her husband Anthony Weiner. He said there were hundreds of thousands. Turns out that was off by hundreds of thousands.
So the president's not going to invoke executive privilege?
The president will make that decision.
So the lingering question as we approach the testimony on Thursday, will the Trump administration try to block the testimony? Anna, it is scheduled for 10 a.m. on Thursday. That's the public testimony, and then the closed session will be at 1. And, you know, some are arguing that since James Comey no longer works for the government, he's a private citizen, they're arguing that any instruction from the president not to testify, it wouldn't hold weight. And in addition, some people say the president may have effectively waived his executive privilege because he's tweeted about James Comey on several occasions. He's referenced their meeting in interviews. So Anna's still waiting for word from the White House on what exactly they might do, if anything. Anna?
All right, Jessica Schneider, that really sums it up as we anticipate that meeting on the 8th, the testimony in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee. I want to widen the conversation here and bring in CNN political analyst David Drucker, CNN legal analyst and constitutional attorney Paige Pate also with us, Shelby Holliday, politics and business reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and Timothy O'Brien. He is the executive editor of Bloomberg View and the author of Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. David, I'll start with you. We just heard from Jessica Schneider about Comey's state of mind, what sources are telling CNN regarding his interactions with the president, that he seemed to think the president was a project, maybe was asking some inappropriate things because he didn't have the experience to know differently. Given what we're learning about what he could testify, does it change anything in terms of your view in the anticipation surrounding his testimony?
No, not really. Look, I think a lot of people are going to anticipate this. I think they're going to watch it, and I think it's going to be highly scrutinized. I think what's interesting here is if the administration actually tried to invoke executive privilege and stop Comey, it makes it look like the president has something to hide. if they let him go ahead and testify, we can already see from Mrs. Conway's interview today that you just played that they're continuing to try and tar and feather James Comey's character, and I think that that's a position that they'd prefer to keep. In other words, let him talk, continue to undermine him and tar his character, and that's what they have done since firing him. It's really been the most interesting part of this, and this is pretty much, I think, why we're in this position. Not so much that they fired Comey, but the way they did it, and ever since they've tried to undermine him. And there's a lot of things you can say about Comey. Both Republicans and Democrats are unhappy with how he handled things last year, but nobody's ever accused the guy of being dishonest. And so I don't know that it's going to serve the administration well to try and continue to go after him, but I think they're now in this position where they don't really have any better option, and trying to stop him from testifying, even if it worked, would then sort of send a signal like you're really worried he's going to say something that's going to make the president in particular look bad, and I don't know that that's a position they want to be in either.
Paige Pate, we heard from both Kellyanne Conway as well as Sean Spicer today not rule out that the president would invoke executive privilege. What's your response or reaction to the fact they're maybe considering this?
Anna, I find it incredible, honestly. I mean, let's back up and talk a little bit about executive privilege. There is no law that sets out what executive privilege is. It's not written in the Constitution. There has developed this understanding that a president can keep his discussions about national security and other vital interest privilege. In other words, he doesn't have to talk about it. No one in the administration has to talk about it in front of Congress or other proceedings. But every time an executive privilege has gone in front of a court, the court has limited that privilege. They will not uphold executive privilege. In other words, they will require an administration official to talk if the issue involves something that, number one, has already been discussed by the administration, and we have that here because the White House and Trump specifically has already made statements about his meetings with James Comey, and two, the issue that they're trying to protect has to be something in the public interest, not just something that may protect the president's personal interests. So I don't see them being able to successfully invoke executive privilege, and the decision to do it, I think, would be a huge mistake here unless he has no other choice, unless he's convinced that James Comey is going to say Trump is lying about what we talked about in our meetings.
Timothy, do you think they're really mulling this over or just trying to build some suspense?
I think they are not a group of strategic thinkers, and I think they've had a sort of a slash and burn mentality about how to deal with this FBI probe and with Congress since it began, and I think to their detriment. They aren't on very firm ground here if Trump tries to invoke executive privilege. This brings us back to Watergate, you know, when Nixon tried to prevent the release of the Watergate tapes.
It didn't work.
It didn't work. The Supreme Court said you have to disclose, and 16 days or so later he resigned. And I think to continue to go after Comey's character and then to invoke executive privilege when Trump's been tweeting quite publicly about these matters and he's had spokespeople out sort of rumbling on the hustings for him, I think that they're on very weak ground, and I don't think it's strategic. I think it's defensive.
Shelby, is it better for the Trump administration, or I guess maybe the better question is, a bigger risk for them to invoke executive privilege versus allowing Comey to testify? Which one's the bigger risk?
Politically, it's very risky to try to block him from testifying because Trump has already fired him. There was tremendous backlash after President Trump fired Comey. You also have a growing list of events that are now public, including Trump's dinner with Comey. Trump made phone calls to Comey. Trump administration officials asked top officials in the intelligence community to come out and sort of bat the story down and defend President Trump. You also have President Trump's tweets, things he said on the record, things he told Lester Holt. He's admitted that the Russia investigation bothered him. So I don't think Comey's expected to give any sort of bombshell answers. He will possibly address the memos. But in general, we already know a lot of the things that President Trump has done. You know, proving obstruction of justice requires intent, but he already does have all of these actions that look like he was trying to mess with the investigation or influence it in some sort of way.
On the issue of intent, Paige Pate, let me ask you about this idea that perhaps one individual conversation could have been seen as innocent enough, and we just heard from, our reporting with Jessica Schneider, Gloria Borger, talking to sources who say that there, were multiple meetings, each individually looked at alone. Comey didn't really want to go to obstructing justice. He didn't think there was enough there. But perhaps in retrospect, he could be asked, when you take the sum of all those meetings, could it point to intent?
Absolutely. And the one thing that Comey didn't know then that he knows now is that the president fired him to stop the Russia investigation. So the fact that the conduct continued after those meetings, the fact that the statements continued after those initial meetings, all of that shows intent, whereas James Comey would not have known that he was going to be fired during those meetings. And think about it. For an FBI director to accuse a sitting president of committing a felony, he's going to be very reluctant to do that unless he's sure. But once he got fired, I think the evidence is now very strong.
Timothy, is James Comey a credible witness?
Of course he's a credible witness. He's been an inflammatory personality for a variety of reasons during the 2016 campaign and more recently. But I don't think anyone has ever thought that he's a flat-out liar. And
Jared Kushner has to be extremely careful what he says to people. He cannot be in a position where it's later claimed that, he's witness tampering. There are people around him who are going to eventually testify. If he goes up and gives them instructions about how to think about this or that, that can be considered tampering. It's one of the reasons why I think that Jared Kushner should be considering the possibility, in a serious way, of taking a leave of absence.
Maeve Reston, CNN national political reporter, is joining us now. Maeve, is there influence waning in the White House?
I mean, I think that the investigation has created such a cloud around Jared Kushner at this point that there's no way in which he couldn't be taking a step back in terms of his role, which was so vast and broad in the White House before. And like David Gergen said, there are a lot of concerns now as this investigation escalates about what he says, what he's advising on. But we don't really know what all the conversations were, last year and this year between Jared Kushner and President Trump. How much running room he gave him. He gave him a lot of running room. But it's clear that, that while he is taking a less visible role at this point, that, Ivanka will always be that trusted advisor to her father. And, she talked about in an interview in April with CBS, talked about speaking quietly to the president, speaking with total candor on a lot of those issues that she disagrees with him on, like climate change, Planned Parenthood. So there is kind of a quiet advocacy role there that I think remains undiminished. But as far as Jared Kushner, clearly they know that, there is a lot of legal jeopardy there, and he's certainly taking a less visible role,
And a threat to the United States. You know what's interesting about all the discussions we had through the last several weeks have been focused on one singular issue. Is Paris good or not for this country? That's the discussions I've had with the president. And whether there were good environmental objectives that were achieved as a result of Paris. His decision was no, and that was the extent of our discussions. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes or no?
Yes, ma'am.
Does the president believe today that climate change is a hoax? That's something, of course, he said in the campaign. When the pool was up in the Oval Office with him a couple days ago, he refused to answer. So I'm wondering if you can speak for him.
I did answer the question because I said the discussions the president and I have had over the last several weeks have been focused on one key issue. Is Paris good or bad for this country?
Well, if you're the EPA administrator, shouldn't you be able to tell the American people whether or not the president still believes that climate change is a hoax? Where does he stand?
As I indicated several times through the process, there's enough to deal with respect to the Paris Agreement and making an informed decision about this important issue. That's what our focus has been over the last several weeks. I've answered the question a couple times.
Does the president share the EPA administrator's thoughts on this topic? And why has the administration sort of backed away from using the words climate change?
I have not, as I mentioned to Zeke, I have not had an opportunity to specifically talk to the president about that.
Let's bring in CNN senior White House correspondent Jim Acosta. You were there for that briefing. Jim, does it seem that the president's spokesman, Sean Spicer, doesn't actually talk to the president? Because he just keeps on saying, I haven't had a chance to talk to the president about that. And he was asked the same question the day before.
Well, I do know that Sean Spicer is in meetings with the president from time to time. I can't say exactly when is the last time he had a chance to talk to the president and whether he brought up this issue, but It is an interesting question. We asked Sean Spicer this earlier this week. I think the expectation would be, if you've had a few days to come up with an answer, that you would have an answer. But you heard the press secretary during that briefing today. He was asked, well, you know, we asked you to go back and talk to the president about this. Have you had a chance to do this? He said he didn't have an opportunity to do so. I think part of that, Anna, is because administration officials, top White House officials, including Gary Cohn, Kellyanne Conway, you heard the EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, take a swing at this during the briefing today. They just don't have that answer from the president, and so they are simply dancing around this very critical question, which is whether or not the president believes in climate change, whether he still believes it's a hoax that's perpetrated by the Chinese to weaken American manufacturers, as he's said periodically in tweets and so on. And it is stunning to hear administration officials over and over again ask this question when they've had a good 24 hours since this Rose Garden speech. Obviously, one of the questions that would be asked, you know, looking back at the president's comments in the past, is where does he stand on this issue? And they just simply did not have an answer for us today. You did hear the EPA administrator, though, Anna, say that they do believe that carbon emissions are being brought down, that progress has been made on CO2 emissions. So if you're talking about, well, we believe we've made progress on CO2 emissions and carbon emissions, then one would think they believe, or that the president believes, that climate change is occurring and that human activity, which results in carbon emissions, is a contributing factor when it comes to climate change. But they're just not willing to answer that question. And it sort of reminds me, Anna, of when the president made that comment about, well, President Obama wiretapped me at Trump Tower, and we've gone back and forth with the White House over and over again for months and months and months about this charge made by the president, and the president still never withdrew that comment. I don't think the president is going to withdraw this comment. It'll be fascinating if he finally says, I do believe in climate change, because that would essentially mean in the past he had been wrong on the issue.
There's been so much dancing around in recent days, but even during the campaign he seemed to soften his stance when he was asked about whether climate change was a hoax, and it seemed he had evolved on that issue. The administration likes to use that word, evolution, in terms of his positions, but again, they continue to dodge the direct question and answering just yes or no. Does he believe it is real? Let me ask you about another point that was brought up at this briefing, and that is, of course, the upcoming testimony of James Comey, the fired FBI director. He'll testify to the Senate Intelligence Committee next Thursday at 10 a.m. It'll be an open briefing initially. A lot on the line at that briefing. What do we know about whether the president's going to try to stop Comey from speaking?
That, too, is an unresolved question, Anna. During the briefing, Sean Spicer was asked about this. He said that question is being reviewed, which is a pretty stunning comment, because it means that this White House, the White House counsel's office, the president, that they want to take a look at this and at least hold out the prospect, or even perhaps you could call it a threat, that the president could sort of come in here at the last second and say, no, I'm invoking executive privilege. I would like to block James Comey from testifying. I think you'd have to bring in some constitutional experts, some balance of power experts to determine whether or not the Congress could at that point try to challenge the president in some sort of constitutional fashion to see whether or not he is even capable of doing that. But it is a very interesting question whether the president would actually attempt to do that, because obviously it would signal once again the president trying to interfere or get in the way of the public hearing from James Comey. And of course, it was during those meetings with James Comey that the former FBI director says that the president attempted to basically ask him, well, can you let me know whether I'm in hot water on all of this? It would again add more questions to this whole saga as to what the president is up to when it comes to James Comey.
Jim Acosta, thank you. Let's dig deeper with our panel. Joining us, CNN contributor John Dean, who was White House counsel for Richard Nixon, Eric Lischblau, the assistant managing editor of CNN's Washington Bureau, and CNN legal analyst Laura Coates, a former federal prosecutor. So, Eric, we have some new reporting on Comey's state of mind leading into this testimony. What are we learning?
Well, I think one point that he is likely to hit is that this was a process for him with the president as well as the country, a process of trying to understand these sort of awkward overtures, if you will, from Trump that seemed so unusual coming from the White House. I think what we're hearing is that no one of them perhaps crossed over the line or clearly smashed through the line of manipulating or pressuring the FBI to drop the investigation, and perhaps Comey felt that he could sort of handle or educate the president. But added up cumulatively, and certainly in the light of now of Comey's firing, there was sort of the appearance that the president was trying to take control of this investigation because it threatened him personally.
So, Laura, if that were to be his testimony, that doesn't sound good for the president.
No, it doesn't. But remember, you have to think about it in context. If the end game of the FBI investigation was to determine whether or not there was collusion between a foreign entity, that being Russia, and the Trump campaign, then to hinge the entire investigation on an obstruction charge will be a bit odd. And the reason I say that is because obstruction charges are ones you kind of add on to the overall claim. To stop there would be a gift to the administration if they are in fact guilty of any type of crime. Because it would say to the people, look, that roadblock you put up also stop the investigation into whatever was beyond it. So it would be odd, it would be hard for the administration to swallow that tough, very tough pill, but it would not conclude that the investigation should have stopped at that particular point.
All right, John Dean, so let's talk about executive privilege. Should the president try to invoke executive privilege in this scenario? What would you advise?
Well, and I probably know as much about executive privilege as anybody. And it is only been recognized one place in the law. That was in U.S. versus Nixon, a Supreme Court case on the tapes. And I've got to tell you, I've never heard of any president invoking executive privilege on a witness and insisting he not testify. It's something that is done through collaboration and discussion. He has absolutely no authority, without short of going to court, to force Comey to comply with his desire to invoke executive privilege. If Comey doesn't want to, he doesn't have to. He's not bound by any kind of contractual relation or binding commitment to the executive branch.
And that's because he's a private citizen now?
That's because that's the only leverage you have, is you could remove somebody from their job if the president didn't want them to testify. But let's say my own situation. When I testified and Nixon didn't want me testifying, he never threatened me with executive privilege because there was no way to enforce it. So I don't really know what all this talk about invoking executive privilege. It sounds like a PR move to me, where Trump is going to, he has nothing to invoke, but it's going to say, well, I won't invoke it, now let him go ahead and testify because I'm not afraid of what he's going to say. So it's a lot of smoke to me.
And Laura, obviously the president has himself brought up publicly what was discussed in these private conversations. He talked to Lester Holt in that NBC interview about having the conversation with President and with Comey on at least 3 occasions, asking him whether he was under investigation and being told, according to the president, that he was not under investigation in their conversation. So does that in effect waive parts of executive privilege?
If there was a privilege to assert in this case, and your prior guest is absolutely right, that has no teeth to it, he could say, you know, listen, I've already waived part of that by actually disclosing parts of the contents of that conversation. People are focused on executive privilege because, remember, Sally Yates also testified, and she chose in her testimony to honor a form of privilege. Remember, she wasn't talking about executive privilege. She's talking about the fact that she was a government lawyer, and her role was different than that of FBI Director Comey. So there was an ethical obligation that may have been there for Sally Yates that was not there where there is the absence of an attorney-client privilege or the thought of one. And remember, that same case about Nixon in terms of turning over those tapes, the courts did also go on to say not only is that privilege really not applicable here, but you also, if there is a criminal investigation, then the interests of Congress and the people of the United States can override even that privilege. Here, you've got a criminal investigation, a special counsel, Robert Mueller. This is not the opportunity to invoke that privilege, even if it had teeth.
What's the bigger risk politically or you know, optics here, Eric, if he invokes the executive privilege versus not?
Well, I think politically it certainly could boomerang on the White House if they really were to take that step. And as John and Laura said, that's a big if, whether they really would cross that bridge. But, you know, that's something that would make it appear on the grandest stage possible that they had something to hide, that the president was personally intervening to silence the FBI director that he fired after reports of trying to quash an investigation. That would send a powerful signal and a pretty threatening one, I would think, to the White House.
John, if Comey acknowledged before Congress that what's in these memos that we've learned of are true and that President Trump asked him to drop the case against Michael Flynn, is that enough for some type of criminal charge or grounds for impeachment?
Well, it may or may not be. It may fit into a larger pattern of information that we have. Comey may have part of it. I don't think he has all of it. Even his Trump's tweets may tell us, or his later conversation with the Russians. We have to look at it in a larger frame. I don't think that Comey alone is going to drive a nail in the issue. So it's just a piece of it is what he's going to offer in this testimony.
And remember, Anna, the claim of obstruction doesn't just relate to Comey, although that's certainly a few of the most dramatic moments. There are also allegedly attempts to silence two other, the head of NSA and CIA, and along with others to get them to either say that there was no merit to the investigation, so that there are other potential pieces of ammunition in an indictment besides Comey.
Laura, in your mind, what could be the most revealing question asked of Comey?
Well, whether or not that his conversation about the motivation for wanting to drop the investigation into Flynn was politically motivated or not. That's going to be the damning evidence that would contradict yet another assertion from the White House as to the motivation of doing so. It wouldn't end the inquiry with respect to collusion, but again, it's the totality of circumstances that we have here that can prove a case. We don't have the low-hanging fruit, but if you show us an apple and there's more in the orchard, that will be the issue here.
All right, Laura Coates, John Dean, and Eric Lichtblau, thank you all.
Thank you.
An explosive new report to tell you about suggesting the Trump administration secretly explored lifting sanctions against Russia in just the first weeks of his presidency. Hear why it perhaps did not happen. Plus, CNN tracks down the Russian banker who met with Jared Kushner. The big question, why is the White House saying one thing about the meeting and Russia saying another? And more on why the White House can't say if President Trump believes climate change is real. Well, this is live right now. Looks like the president is getting ready to sign some legislation. Let's listen in.
Thank you all. It's a great honor. And thank our Vice President for being here. Thank you. Ivanka Trump, thank you for being here. And we have a great group behind us, incredible people. Some of you are very good friends for a long time. Good afternoon. It's an honor to be with you, the men and women of law enforcement, as well as two fantastic state attorneys general who are always proud to stand by the side of law enforcement officers. That's Pam Bondi and Leslie Rutledge. Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to thank also Chuck Canterbury, President of the Fraternal Order of Police, and Sheriff Greg Champagne, President of the National Sheriff's Association. Where are you folks? Good. Appreciate you being here. Really two great champions of law enforcement. We are here today to reaffirm our unbreakable support for the American heroes who keep our streets, our homes, and our citizens safe, and they've been doing an amazing job under very adverse conditions. We will always support the incredible men and women of law enforcement. I can speak very strongly for myself and for Mike Pence, Vice President. We are behind you 100%. Every single day, America's law enforcement officers, firefighters, first responders, and their families make tremendous sacrifices for their communities and for their nation. When a home is threatened, when danger visits our doorstep, when innocent lives are on the line, Americans turn to their courageous officers of law enforcement because we know they are here to serve and to protect us all. They sacrifice every day to keep us safe. Many have paid the ultimate price, laying down their lives to save others. incredible people. They're true heroes, and we will always be grateful. So I want to thank you folks. That is so true. Our duty as Americans is to honor their service and sacrifice, and to protect those who protect us. Today I am proud to sign 2 laws to help fulfill that very, very sacred commitment. First, the Public Safety Officers Benefits Improvement Act will help disabled officers and firefighters and families of those who fall in the line of duty quickly receive all of the benefits they so justly deserve. People have wanted this for a long time, and I'm not just talking to the people behind me, I'm talking about many people that represent the people behind me, family members and friends and people that just appreciate the work they do, which is incredible. For too long, injured officers have suffered, and the children of fallen officers have put their dreams of college on hold, while bureaucracy delayed crucial benefits, made it impossible for their families. No longer. It's unacceptable and is going to end today. In fact, it's going to end in about 1 minute. This bill speeds approval times by giving state and local enforcement greater role in determining eligibility and lets applicants track the progress of their claims online. So a much, much faster situation. You're all happy with that? You know what I'm talking about, right? We've been waiting for this for years. Second, the American Law Enforcement Heroes Act allows the use of federal grants to help our military veterans transition to new careers in law enforcement. America is proud of our veterans, and I think I can say a double proud or a triple proud. We love our veterans, and they're serving overseas. They're in harm's way. They are doing things that very few people would have the courage to do, and we will be and always will be incredibly proud to have them with us, and they've been with us like nobody, and we are going to be protecting them. They've been protecting us. We're going to be helping them right now. They've really been with us in terms of freedom, in terms of our rights, and we're right now in terms of their rights. As president, keeping Americans safe is my highest duty, and supporting law enforcement is my unwavering commitment. I am very proud to sign these 2 great bills today. I want to thank everybody for being here, and if you have the bills, we'll sign them. This has been years in the making, and I will tell you that this is something that I'm very happy to be doing. So congratulations, everybody. Congratulations.
Former Obama economic advisor Austin Goolsbee. He chaired the Council of Economic Advisors during President Obama's first term. All right, Senator, to you first. This question, does the president believe in climate change? Why is this such a difficult question to answer?
I think probably because it doesn't really matter. I mean, I think what matters is 2 things.
Why
really
doesn't it matter?
Yeah, I'll explain. 2 things really matter. Number one, what is the impact of this treaty on the United States of America? And number 2, does the treaty actually do something positive toward averting climate change? And on both scores, what the president has said and his people have said is no. Number one, it's not good for America. Number two, even if it was good for America, it doesn't really do anything to solve the problem. So on both cases, whether you believe in climate change or believe that man is altering the climate, this treaty doesn't do anything about it, and it's bad for the U.S. End of story.
Austin, is that how you see it?
No, and that's not the way the majority of America sees it either. I mean, I'm sure you saw the polls came out yesterday. They released that the majority of the American people in every state, there is a majority in every state supporting this agreement. It's not a treaty. It doesn't actually make sense what Donald Trump said. The fact checkers went through his speech and it lit up the board, like a pinball machine of falsities. In my opinion, I think it's somewhat sad that the United States has come to this, that a non-binding agreement in which the countries of the world got together and said we're going to try to affect how much carbon pollution we're putting out, including all the countries of the world except for Syria, Nicaragua, and now the United States. I think it's sad that we're going to pull ourselves out of that. And you saw major CEOs from industries all across the board in the United States condemning this decision that Donald Trump made. I think it's a mistake, and we're going to look back on it and regret it.
Senator, where does the Republican Party stand when it comes to climate change? What is the stance of the GOP?
Well, I think it's all over the map. I think most Republicans are very skeptical about the role that man plays in.
And why is that? Because the science is very clear.
No,
95%+ of climate scientists say it's very real.
That's a bogus number. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists who have signed documents and published letters
hundreds,
saying,
if not thousands? Which ones?
Saying, well, I haven't added them up, but I've seen lists for over a long period of time of people who question not that the climate is changing. I don't question the climate is changing. I suspect Donald Trump doesn't question that the climate is changing, but the climate's always changing. The question is, what role does man play in that change? And that's where there's disagreement, number one. And number two, what man can do about it is also even more challenged, because most of it is, Austin talks about, all these countries that have volunteered to reduce emissions. Well, of course, that's not true. China is increasing their emissions, is going to continue to increase their emissions, and they are the biggest polluter there is. India is going to increase their emissions. In fact, most of the third world, under this agreement, is going to increase their emissions, and the only one that's really agreed to, wrongly in my opinion, to hamper their economy and hamstring their economy by dramatically reducing is the United States. Bad deal.
Austin, your response?
Well, look, factually that's not correct on either count. As a scientist, I do not believe that Senator Santorum is very good. He's not describing what the scientific findings have been. It doesn't take a lab or a PhD to figure out that if you smoke, you're more likely to get lung cancer, that if you emit carbon pollution, and we know that carbon in the atmosphere contributes to global warming, that human activity is correlated with the changing climate. Now, we can have a sober discussion, and I agree with the senator that we should think about what the costs are and how fast that we can do those, and we should expect other countries to come on board. But, in a case like this where it was a non-binding thing in which all the countries of the world are holding hands and saying, let's try to work toward an improvement, for the United States to thumb its nose at the world, when it was a non-binding agreement to begin with, it really just hands world leadership over to countries like China and Russia and our adversaries.
Let me just ask you, Austin, about the jobs issue, because if you say Trump is so bad for the economy, and we're talking about that's the reason, at least that's his reasoning for getting out of the Paris Climate Accord, is because it's bad for the economy. I mean, look at what's happening on Wall Street right now. We're seeing record territory. We had the jobs numbers come out today. The unemployment numbers at 4.3% now. That's the lowest since 2001. People are seeing their 401ks go up. Does that give the president a little bit of rope when it comes to something maybe controversial, like getting out of the Paris Climate Accord?
I don't know. The time scale of those two numbers are so totally different. One of the issues of carbon pollution, climate change, and the environment are over decades, and the numbers that came out today and from the stock market are over a couple of months. The jobs numbers today were actually quite disappointing. They were supposed to be far better, but 1 month is not a trend, and so I think we're just going to have to keep our eye on the short-run economy.
I also want to ask you, Senator Santorum, about the economic angle of all of this, because, again, going back to the facts, we saw solar employment expand last year 17 times faster than the rest of the total U.S. economy. There's a lot of money to be made in clean energy, isn't there?
Look, I'm a big proponent of clean energy. I have no problem with clean energy. I'm involved with a waste energy company. I'm also, do some work for the ethanol industry, which is a very, very important industry in this country. As long as it's a market-based solution, let's move toward more and cleaner. In fact, the United States has been, even without the Paris Accords, and is going to, even not being involved with the Paris Accords. And I think that's a positive thing, and it creates jobs, but it needs to be done in a way that economically makes sense. The worst thing we can do as a country, if in fact the cataclysmic results of man-made climate change are true, is to be in a position where we can't react to it because our economy's in the dumper. We need to be in a position where we're strong, we can take measures that are necessary to repair whatever problems may come about. I don't necessarily believe those things. I think all the projections have been way overstated. They haven't kept up over the last 20 years. If you look at what was projected and where we are now, we're not even close to what they thought was going to happen. Why? To get to Austin's point, because carbon is only one of many, many factors that determine what the climate's going to do. And to suggest one factor, which is a trace gas in the atmosphere, is the tail that wags the entire climate dog, again, doesn't really follow science, in my opinion.
I know the discussion does not end there, but our show continues. So we got to get in a break. So, guys, thank you both for joining us. Rick Santorum and Austin Goolsbee will have you both back. Up next, new questions today for why Jared Kushner met